Maria Gonzalez stood at her kitchen window, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across her small backyard garden. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her coffee mug, the steam rising like tiny prayers into the cool Arizona air. The house had been her sanctuary for 15 years, every corner filled with memories of her late husband Carlos and their daughter Sophia, who was now away at college. The neighborhood had always been quiet, filled with families who knew each other's names and watched out for one another's children. Mrs. Chun next door still brought over extra vegetable from her garden, and old Mr. Rodriguez across the street always waved from his porch swing. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors completely. That morning felt different, though. There was a tension in the air that Maria couldn't quite place. She had received a letter 3 days ago from the city planning department, something about new development plans for the area. She hadn't opened it yet, choosing instead to let it sit on her kitchen table like an unwelcome guest. Sometimes ignorance felt safer than knowledge. The sound of heavy machinery in the distance made her stomach clench. For weeks now, there had been rumors circulating through the neighborhood about potential changes coming their way. Some said it was just routine road maintenance. Others whispered about something much bigger. Maria had chosen not to listen to the gossip, preferring to focus on her daily routine of tending to her garden and preparing for Sophia's upcoming visit during spring break. She walked outside to check on her tomato plants, the ones Carlos had helped her plant the year before he passed. The soil was rich and dark, fed by years of careful composting and love. The plants were just beginning to show tiny green buds that promised a bountiful harvest. This garden had sustained her through the darkest days of grief, providing both physical nourishment and emotional healing. As she knelt among the plants, Maria noticed a man in a hard hat standing at the edge of her property line. He held a clipboard and was making notes while looking directly at her house. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. Perhaps he was just checking utility lines or conducting some routine survey. The man approached her fence line and called out, "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm with Morrison Development Company. We'll need to schedule a time to discuss some upcoming changes to this area. Have you received our notices?" Maria's blood ran cold. Morrison Development Company was a name she had heard whispered in fearful tones throughout the community. They were known for buying up entire neighborhoods and transforming them into commercial complexes or luxury developments that longtime residents could never afford. The very mention of their name had driven several families to sell their homes and move away. "I haven't opened any letters yet," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of changes are you talking about?" The man's expression softened slightly, as if he understood the impact his words would have. "There's going to be a new shopping complex built in this area. The city has already approved the plans. Most of the houses in this block will need to be demolished to make room for the project." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Demolished. Her home, her garden, her memories, all of it reduced to rubble to make way for another soulless shopping center. She gripped the fence post to steady herself, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become unstable. "But this is my home," she managed to say. "I've lived here for 15 years. My husband is buried just 10 minutes away. My daughter grew up in this house. You can't just tear it down." The man looked genuinely sympathetic, but his words offered no comfort. "I understand this is difficult news, Mrs. Gonzalez. The company will be offering fair market compensation for all properties. You'll have 60 days to make arrangements. 60 days. 2 months to dismantle a lifetime of memories and find somewhere new to call home." Maria thought about her neighbors, many of whom were elderly and had lived in the area for decades. Where would they go? How could they possibly start over at their age? That evening, Maria finally opened the letter that had been sitting on her kitchen table. The official letterhead confirmed everything the man had told her, but seeing it in writing made it feel even more real and terrifying. The compensation offer was far less than what she would need to buy a comparable home in a decent neighborhood. It would barely cover a down payment on a smaller place in a less desirable area. She called Sophia immediately, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. When her daughter's voice came through the phone, Maria broke down completely, sobbing as she tried to explain what was happening. Sophia had grown up in this house, taken her first steps in the living room, learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway. How could Maria explain that all of those places would soon cease to exist? "Mom, slow down," Sophia said gently. Tell me exactly what happened." Through her tears, Maria recounted the conversation with the developer representative and the contents of the letter. Sophia listened without interrupting, but Maria could hear her daughter's breathing become more rapid and shallow as the reality of the situation sank in. "They can't do this," Sophia finally said, her voice filled with anger. "There has to be something we can do to fight it. That house is our family's heritage." But even as Sophia spoke those words, both women knew the truth that neither wanted to acknowledge. Large development companies with city backing rarely lost these battles. They had lawyers, political connections, and seemingly unlimited resources to push through their projects. Individual homeowners, especially those of modest means like Maria, stood little chance against such powerful forces. That night, Maria walked through every room of her house, touching familiar objects and remembering the stories they held. The dining room table where she and Carlos had shared thousands of meals and made plans for their future. The bedroom where Sophia had crawled into their bed during thunderstorms. The kitchen where 3 generations of family recipes had been prepared with love. She paused at a photograph on the mantelpiece showing Carlos in his military uniform. He had served 2 tours overseas before settling down to build a life with Maria. He had always been her protector, her source of strength when the world seemed too overwhelming. Now she faced the biggest challenge of her life without him, feeling smaller and more vulnerable than ever before. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by anxiety and the sound of heavy machinery that seemed to grow closer with each passing hour. When morning finally arrived, Maria discovered that several of her neighbors had also received similar letters. Mrs. Chan was sitting on her front steps, crying softly while clutching an official document. Mr. Rodriguez stood in his doorway, looking stunned and defeated. The tight-knit community that had sustained them all for so many years was being systematically dismantled by people who saw their neighborhood as nothing more than square footage to be developed. The homes that had sheltered families, witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, were being reduced to obstacles in the path of progress. Maria made coffee and carried a cup to Mrs. Chun, sitting beside her elderly neighbor on the concrete steps. Neither woman spoke for a long time, but their shared silence contained volumes of understanding and mutual grief. They had become refugees in their own neighborhood, displaced by forces beyond their control or comprehension. "What are we going to do?" Mrs. Chun finally whispered. Maria had no answer. She could only hold her neighbor's hand and wonder how their quiet, peaceful world had suddenly become a battlefield where they were destined to lose. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as nearly 50 residents gathered for an emergency meeting 3 days after the demolition notices had been delivered. Maria arrived early, clutching a folder containing her property documents and the threatening letter from Morrison Development Company. The familiar faces around her reflected a mixture of anger, fear, and determination that mirrored her own turbulent emotions. Tom Bradley, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 23 years, stood at the front of the room attempting to bring order to the chaos. His wife Janet sat in the front row, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the stress they were all experiencing. Dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands betrayed the sleepless nights she had endured since receiving their notice. "We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we can formulate any kind of response," Tom announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing classrooms full of restless teenagers. "Has anyone been able to find out more details about this Apache project?" Mrs. Chun raised her hand tentatively. Despite being in her 70s, she had spent the last 2 days researching everything she could find about Morrison Development Company and their proposed shopping complex. Her grandson had helped her navigate the internet, printing out articles and city planning documents that painted a disturbing picture of corporate power and political corruption. "The project is called Apache Springs Shopping Complex," she reported, consulting her handwritten notes. "It's supposed to be a massive retail and entertainment center with over 200 stores, restaurants, and a multiplex movie theater. The city council approved the initial plans last month in a closed session." A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. Closed sessions meant the public had been deliberately excluded from discussions that would fundamentally alter their lives and community. The democratic process had been circumvented, leaving residents with no voice in decisions that would destroy their homes. James Patterson, a mechanic who owned a small auto repair shop on the edge of the development zone, stood up angrily. His shop had been in his family for 2 generations, built by his grandfather during the Great Depression and maintained through decades of economic ups and downs. The thought of losing it to make room for another chain restaurant made his blood boil. "This is complete garbage," he declared, his voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. "They're stealing our livelihoods and our heritage to build another plastic shopping mall that could be located anywhere. There's plenty of empty land on the outskirts of town where they could build this thing without destroying established neighborhoods." Dr. Sarah Martinez, a local physician who had been treating many of the families for years, nodded in agreement. She had seen firsthand how displacement affected people's health, particularly elderly residents who struggled with the stress of forced relocation. The psychological trauma of losing one's home could trigger serious medical conditions, especially in vulnerable populations. "We need to consider the broader impact this will have on our community," she added. "Many of our neighbors are senior citizens on fixed incomes. The compensation being offered isn't sufficient to purchase comparable housing in today's market. We're essentially talking about forcing longtime residents into homelessness or substandard living conditions." Maria found herself standing up, surprising herself with her courage. The words came slowly at first, then gained momentum as she thought about Carlos and all the sacrifices they had made to build their life in this neighborhood. Her voice carried across the room with an emotional intensity that commanded everyone's attention. "My husband served this country in 2 wars, she began, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "When he came home, all we wanted was a quiet place to raise our daughter and live peaceful lives. We worked 2 jobs each for years to afford our little house. We planted every tree in our yard, painted every room with our own hands, and created a place where our family could feel safe and loved." Tears began to flow down her cheeks, but her voice remained strong and clear. "Now, they want to tear it all down so someone can sell overpriced clothes and fast food to people who will never care about this place the way we do. They're stealing our history, our memories, our sense of belonging. And for what? More profit for people who already have more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes." The room erupted in applause and expressions of support. Maria's words had given voice to the anger and heartbreak they were all feeling. Her willingness to be vulnerable in front of her neighbors created a bond of shared determination that hadn't existed before that moment. Frank Morrison himself arrived at the community center just as Maria finished speaking. The developer was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than most residents spent on clothing in an entire year. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room from solidarity to confrontation. "I understand there are concerns about our development project," he announced without introduction, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to managing public relations crises. "I'd like to address some of the misconceptions that seem to be circulating and explain the benefits this project will bring to the entire community." The room fell silent, but the tension was palpable. Morrison seemed oblivious to the hostile stares and crossed arms that greeted his presence. He had probably given similar speeches in dozens of other communities where his company had demolished neighborhoods to build their commercial complexes. Apache Springs Shopping Complex will create over 3,000 jobs and generate millions of dollars in tax revenue for the city, he continued, consulting notes on his smartphone. "The economic benefits will far outweigh any temporary inconvenience caused by the construction process." Mrs. Patterson, James's elderly mother who had lived in the neighborhood since 1952, slowly rose to her feet. At 84 years old, she moved carefully but with dignity, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of change and understood the difference between progress and destruction. "Young man," she said, addressing Morrison with the tone of a school principal correcting a misbehaving child, "I've been living here longer than you've been alive. I've seen this neighborhood grow from empty desert into a real community where people care about each other. Your shopping mall might create jobs for teenagers working in retail stores, but it will destroy something far more valuable, a place where families can put down roots and build lasting relationships with their neighbors." Morrison's professional smile faltered slightly as Mrs. Patterson continued. You talk about economic benefits, but what's the economic value of Mrs. Chun teaching neighborhood children to speak Mandarin in her living room? What's the dollar amount you'd place on Mr. Rodriguez fixing bicycles for free in his garage? How do you quantify the worth of Maria's garden feeding families during hard times? The developer attempted to regain control of the narrative by citing statistics about property values and commercial development, but his words sounded hollow and disconnected from the reality of people's lives. He spoke about market forces and economic inevitability as though human communities were simply obstacles to be overcome rather than valuable entities worthy of preservation. Dr. Martinez raised her hand and was recognized by Tom Bradley. Mr. Morrison, have you or your company conducted any studies on the health impacts of forced displacement on elderly residents? Do you have any provisions for helping people find comparable housing within their financial means? Morrison's response was evasive and filled with corporate jargon about market rate compensation and transitional assistance programs that sounded impressive but offered no concrete help for people facing the loss of their homes. It became increasingly clear that the company viewed residents as minor inconveniences rather than human beings with legitimate needs and concerns. The meeting continued for another 2 hours as residents asked pointed questions about timelines, legal options, and alternative locations for the development. Morrison's answers revealed the extent to which the project was already predetermined, with construction scheduled to begin within 6 months regardless of community opposition. As the evening wound down, the developer made one final attempt to win over the crowd by emphasizing the inevitability of the project and suggesting that resistance would only make the process more difficult for everyone involved. His words contained an implicit threat that cooperation would be rewarded while opposition might result in even less favorable treatment. After Morrison left, the residents remained behind to discuss their options. Tom Bradley had contacted a lawyer who specialized in property rights and eminent domain cases, but the initial consultation had revealed the steep uphill battle they faced. The city had already approved the project, and overturning such decisions required proving either procedural violations or demonstrating that the development served no legitimate public interest. The group decided to organize a formal opposition committee with representatives from each affected street. They would research similar cases in other cities, petition for public hearings, and explore every legal avenue available to them. It was a long shot, but the alternative was simply accepting defeat without a fight. As Maria drove home that night, she felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. The solidarity she had witnessed at the meeting was inspiring, but she also understood the enormous challenges they faced. Morrison Development Company had money, political connections, and legal resources that dwarfed anything the neighborhood could muster. Still, something had awakened in her during those few hours at the community center. For the first time since Carlos's death, she felt connected to something larger than her own grief and isolation. The fight to save their neighborhood had given her a purpose that extended beyond her own survival. The law office of Rebecca Chun, no relation to Maria's neighbor despite the shared surname, occupied the 3rd floor of a modest building downtown. The waiting room featured worn leather chairs and outdated magazines, a far cry from the gleaming corporate offices where Morrison Development Company's legal team operated. Maria sat nervously beside Tom Bradley, clutching a manila folder containing photographs of her home and every document related to her property ownership. Rebecca Chun emerged from her office precisely at 2 o'clock, a petite woman in her 40s with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She had agreed to meet with the neighborhood committee at a reduced rate after hearing about their situation from a mutual friend. Her own family had lost their restaurant to urban renewal projects 30 years earlier, giving her both professional expertise and personal understanding of what these families were experiencing. "I've reviewed the preliminary information you provided," she began, settling behind her desk with a thick file folder. "I need to be honest with you from the start. Morrison Development Company has an extensive legal team and significant political influence. The City Council's approval of this project will be very difficult to overturn through traditional legal channels." Tom Bradley leaned forward, his jaw set with determination. "What would it take to stop this? There has to be something we can do. These are people's homes we're talking about, not just empty lots waiting for development." Rebecca consulted her notes, her expression thoughtful but concerned. "There are several potential approaches we could pursue, but each one requires substantial evidence and resources. We could challenge the environmental impact assessment if it was inadequate. We could argue that the city failed to follow proper procedures for public notification. We could also investigate whether there were any irregularities in how the contracts were awarded. Maria felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. What kind of evidence would we need? Our whole neighborhood is willing to help gather information. The lawyer's expression grew more serious. Environmental challenges require expensive scientific studies and expert testimony. Procedural violations need documentation of every step in the approval process. Corruption investigations demand access to financial records and communication between city officials and the development company. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and research costs. The hope that had briefly flickered in Maria's chest began to fade. The neighborhood committee had managed to raise barely $3,000 through donations and fundraising events. Most of the residents were retirees on fixed incomes or working families with limited savings. They were facing an opponent with virtually unlimited legal resources. Rebecca seemed to recognize their discouragement and continued in a gentler tone. However, there might be another approach worth considering. Public pressure campaigns have been successful in similar cases, especially when they attract media attention and political support. If we can make this about more than just property rights, if we can frame it as a broader issue of community preservation and corporate responsibility, we might be able to generate enough public opposition to make the project politically costly. Tom Bradley's expression brightened slightly. What would that involve exactly? Organized protests, media outreach, social media campaigns, petitions to city council members, and building coalitions with other community groups who might support your cause, Rebecca explained. The goal would be to make this project so controversial that the political cost of supporting it becomes higher than the financial benefits Morrison is offering. Over the next 2 hours, they developed a strategy that combined modest legal pressure with an aggressive public awareness campaign. Rebecca would file formal challenges to the environmental assessment and public notification procedures, knowing they were unlikely to succeed, but hoping to slow down the process and create additional opportunities for public opposition. Meanwhile, the neighborhood committee would launch a comprehensive effort to build public support for their cause. They would create a website documenting the history and character of their community, organize peaceful protests at city council meetings, and reach out to local newspapers and television stations to tell their story. As they left the lawyer's office, Maria felt both energized and overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task ahead. She had never been involved in political activism before, preferring to focus on her family and personal responsibilities. Now she was being asked to become a public spokesperson for a cause that could determine the fate of everything she held dear. The first neighborhood committee meeting in Tom Bradley's living room attracted nearly 30 people, including some residents who had not been involved in earlier discussions. Janet Bradley had prepared coffee and cookies, creating a warm atmosphere that encouraged open discussion and collaboration. Maps of a neighborhood covered the coffee table, marked with colored pins indicating each property affected by the development project. Dr. Martinez had brought her laptop computer and agreed to manage the committee's social media presence. Despite being in her 50s, she was surprisingly adept at platforms like Facebook and Twitter, having used them to communicate with patients and share health information with the broader community. We need to tell our stories in ways that will resonate with people who don't live in our neighborhood, she explained while creating their first Facebook page. Everyone understands the emotional attachment to home and community, but we have to make them care about what happens to us specifically. Mrs. Patterson, James's elderly mother, had been quietly listening to the discussion until this point. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of decades of life experience and wisdom gained through hardship. During the Depression, my family lost our farm to the bank, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I was only 8 years old, but I still remember the day the sheriff came to escort us off our land. My father had worked that soil for 15 years, and my grandfather had homesteaded the original property. We lost everything: our house, our livelihood, our place in the community. The room fell silent as Mrs. Patterson continued. What I learned from that experience is that once you let powerful people take away what belongs to ordinary folks, it becomes easier for them to do it again and again. We have to fight this not just for ourselves, but for every other neighborhood that will face the same threat in the future. Her words galvanized the group in ways that legal strategies and political tactics could not. This was no longer just about preserving their specific houses, but about defending the principle that communities had inherent value that could not be measured in dollars and cents. James Patterson had been researching Morrison Development Company's history and discovered a pattern of similar projects in other cities. In Phoenix, they had demolished a historic African-American neighborhood to build a luxury shopping center that failed within 5 years, leaving behind empty storefronts and displaced families. In Tucson, they had destroyed a community garden and affordable housing complex to construct a big-box retail store that contributed to the decline of local small businesses. "This company is like a locust swarm," he reported to the group. "They come into established communities, strip away everything that makes them unique and valuable, then move on to the next target. They don't care about the long-term consequences because they don't have to live with the results of their actions." Maria found herself thinking about Carlos and wondering what he would have done in this situation. He had always been protective of their family and their home, but he had also believed in standing up for what was right even when it was difficult or dangerous. She could almost hear his voice encouraging her to be brave and fight for their community. The committee decided to focus their first public demonstration around the monthly city council meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. They would arrive early to claim seats in the public gallery and take advantage of the open comment period to present their case directly to elected officials. Local television news crews often attended these meetings, providing an opportunity to reach a broader audience. Dr. Martinez worked late into the night preparing a presentation that would highlight the human impact of forced displacement. She gathered medical research about the health effects of housing instability on elderly residents, statistics about the difficulty of finding affordable housing in the current market, and testimonials from neighbors about what their community meant to them. Maria volunteered to speak on behalf of the committee, despite her nervousness about public speaking. She spent hours practicing her remarks, trying to find words that would convey the depth of her attachment to the neighborhood without sounding desperate or emotional. She wanted to project strength and determination while still connecting with people's capacity for empathy. The night before the city council meeting, Maria walked through her house one more time, touching familiar objects and remembering the life she and Carlos had built together. The kitchen table where they had shared morning coffee and discussed their dreams for the future. The living room where Sophia had taken her first steps and later practiced piano recitals. The bedroom where they had held each other through sleepless nights when Carlos's war nightmares returned to haunt him. She paused at the window, overlooking her garden, where tomato plants were beginning to show the first signs of spring growth. Carlos had always said that you could judge the character of a place by how well things grew there. Their little plot of land had nurtured vegetables, flowers, and fruit trees with remarkable abundance over the years. It seemed criminal to pave over such fertile soil to create another parking lot for another soulless shopping center. As she prepared for bed, Maria felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. Tomorrow would bring the first real test of their opposition campaign, and she had no idea whether their efforts would make any difference in the final outcome. But she knew that she was doing everything possible to honor Carlos's memory and protect the home they had created together. The fight was just beginning, and Maria was ready to stand up and be counted among those who refused to surrender without a battle. The city council chambers buzzed with unusual activity as residents from the affected neighborhood filed in carrying handmade signs and wearing matching blue ribbons that read "Save Our Community." Maria arrived 30 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, her heart pounding with nervous energy as she reviewed her prepared remarks one final time. The gallery seats filled quickly with familiar faces from the neighborhood committee, but also with strangers who had heard about their cause through social media and local news coverage. Council member Patricia Williams, a middle-aged African-American woman who represented the district containing their neighborhood, acknowledged the large turnout with a brief nod before taking her seat at the elevated council table. She had been notably absent from the closed session where the Apache Springs project was initially approved, having been attending her mother's funeral in another state. Her return to the city had coincided with the eruption of community opposition to the development. Mayor Robert Stevens called the meeting to order with his usual pompous ceremony, clearly annoyed by the packed gallery and the unusual level of public interest in city business. He was a thin, balding man in his 60s who had held office for 12 years through a combination of business community support and voter apathy. Most city council meetings attracted fewer than a dozen residents, making it easy for special interests to conduct their business without public scrutiny. We have an unusually long list of speakers signed up for public comment tonight, Mayor Stevens announced with barely concealed irritation. I want to remind everyone that comments are limited to 3 minutes per speaker, and we will not tolerate any disruptions or demonstrations during the proceedings. Maria was the 7th person on the speaker's list, giving her time to observe the reactions of council members to earlier comments. Mrs. Chun spoke first, describing in accented but passionate English how the neighborhood had welcomed her family when they immigrated from Taiwan 15 years ago. Tom Bradley presented a petition signed by over 200 residents opposing the development. Dr. Martinez outlined the health risks associated with displacing elderly residents from their long-term homes. When Maria's name was called, she walked to the podium on unsteady legs, acutely aware that dozens of people were watching her every move. The microphone seemed overly sensitive, amplifying the sound of her breathing and the rustle of her papers. She looked out at the council members, trying to read their expressions and gauge their receptiveness to her message. My name is Maria Gonzalez, and I have lived at 847 Maple Street for 15 years, she began, her voice stronger than she had expected. My husband Carlos served this country in Operation Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom. When he came home from his second deployment, all we wanted was a quiet place where we could raise our daughter and build a peaceful life together. She paused, looking directly at Mayor Stevens before continuing. Carlos died 3 years ago from complications related to chemical exposure during his military service. Before he passed away, he made me promise to take care of our home and our garden because he said they represented everything he had fought to protect, the freedom to live peacefully in a place where you belong. The chamber fell silent as Maria's voice took on greater intensity. Now you want to break that promise by selling our neighborhood to developers who see nothing but dollar signs where we see our life's work. You're asking me to abandon the garden where Carlos and I planted fruit trees to celebrate our daughter's graduation. You're telling me to walk away from the kitchen where I taught Sophia to make her grandmother's recipes. You're demanding that I surrender the bedroom where I held my husband's hand as he took his final breath. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as Maria continued. Morrison Development Company will make millions of dollars from this project and then move on to destroy someone else's neighborhood. You will collect tax revenue from their shopping center for a few years until it becomes outdated and they abandon it like they've done in other cities. But where am I supposed to go? Where Mrs. Chun and Mrs. Patterson and all the other neighbors who have spent decades building relationships and memories in this community. Her 3 minutes were nearly up, but Maria pressed on with growing conviction. You have the power to stop this injustice. You can choose to protect the people who elected you instead of enriching developers who don't even live in our city. I'm asking you to remember that neighborhoods are not just collections of buildings. They are living communities where real people have invested their hearts and souls. Please don't let Morrison Development Company destroy our home. The applause that followed was immediate and sustained, lasting nearly a minute before Mayor Stevens gavelled for order. Maria returned to her seat with tears in her eyes, feeling both emotionally drained and strangely empowered. She had spoken her truth in front of the people who held her future in their hands, and nothing could diminish the importance of that moment regardless of the outcome. Frank Morrison took the podium after the last neighborhood resident had spoken, his expensive suit and polished demeanor creating a stark contrast to the working-class families who had preceded him. He carried a leather briefcase and a tablet computer, projecting an image of corporate professionalism that was clearly intended to intimidate and impress the council members. I appreciate the passion these residents have shown for their neighborhood. He began with practiced condescension, but I think we need to focus on facts rather than emotions when making important policy decisions. Apache Springs Shopping Complex will generate an estimated $4.7 million in annual tax revenue for the city, create 3,200 jobs, and attract visitors from throughout the region. Morrison activated a presentation on the large screen behind the council table, displaying colorful architectural renderings of the proposed shopping center. The images showed gleaming storefronts, manicured landscaping, and happy families enjoying their consumer experiences. Nowhere in the presentation was there any acknowledgement of the neighborhood that would be obliterated to make these images reality. The current residential area generates less than $50,000 per year in property taxes, Morrison continued, clicking through slides of economic projections and demographic studies. From a purely financial standpoint, this redevelopment represents a tremendous opportunity for municipal growth and increased services for all residents. Councilmember Patricia Williams raised her hand and was recognized by the mayor. Mr. Morrison, what provisions has your company made for helping displaced residents find comparable housing within their financial means? Many of these families are elderly people on fixed incomes who may not be able to afford market-rate housing in other neighborhoods. Morrison's smile faltered slightly as he consulted his notes. We are offering fair market compensation based on current property assessments, which should provide adequate resources for most residents to relocate. Our company also maintains relationships with several real estate agencies that specialize in assisting clients with transitional housing needs. Williams pressed further. But, have you conducted any studies to determine whether your compensation offers are actually sufficient to purchase comparable housing in today's market? Have you identified specific properties that would be available and affordable for families earning modest incomes? The developer's response was evasive and filled with corporate jargon about market forces and transitional assistance programs that offered no concrete help for people facing displacement. It became clear that Morrison Development Company had invested far more effort in analyzing potential profits than in addressing the human consequences of their project. Council member David Park, a younger man who had been elected on a platform of responsible development, asked pointed questions about the environmental impact of the project. The proposed shopping center would require the removal of over 100 mature trees and the paving of several acres of natural desert habitat that provided homes for local wildlife. This area has some of the most established vegetation in our city, Park observed, consulting his own research. Many of these trees were planted by residents decades ago and have grown into significant contributors to our urban canopy. Have you considered alternative locations that wouldn't require the destruction of such well-established landscaping? Morrison dismissed these concerns with casual indifference. The landscaping plan for Apache Springs includes extensive plantings of native species and drought-resistant varieties that will be more appropriate for our climate. We're essentially upgrading the environmental quality of the area by replacing aging residential vegetation with professionally designed commercial landscaping. The disconnect between Morrison's corporate speak and the reality of people's lives became increasingly apparent as the evening progressed. He spoke about upgrading and improving the area without any understanding of the value that residents placed on their existing community. To him, their neighborhood was simply an obstacle to be overcome rather than a living ecosystem of human relationships and shared history. Mayor Stevens attempted to move the discussion toward a conclusion, but Councilmember Williams requested additional time for questions from her colleagues. The unusual level of public interest in the issue made it politically risky to rush through the proceedings without adequate discussion. Councilmember Sarah Thompson, who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up with obvious frustration in her voice. I'm troubled by the apparent disconnect between what our residents need and what this development offers. We're talking about displacing dozens of families to build another shopping center in a city that already has more retail space than consumers can support. Her words sparked a heated exchange between council members that revealed deep divisions about the city's development priorities. Morrison grew visibly agitated as the discussion moved away from his carefully prepared talking points and toward broader questions about community preservation and responsible growth. The meeting continued past 10 o'clock as council members debated procedural questions about reopening the approval process. Williams moved to establish a 90-day moratorium on demolition activities to allow for additional public input and environmental review. The motion passed by a narrow margin of 4 votes to 3, providing the neighborhood committee with their first significant victory. As residents filed out of the council chambers, Maria felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The moratorium would give them additional time to build public support and explore legal options, but Morrison's reaction to the delay suggested that he would intensify his efforts to push the project forward. The real battle was just beginning, and both sides now understood that the stakes extended far beyond one neighborhood's fate. The outcome would set a precedent for how the city would balance corporate interests against community preservation in future development decisions. The sound that shattered Maria's sleep at 5:30 in the morning was unlike anything she had ever heard. A deep, mechanical roar followed by the unmistakable crash of splintering wood and collapsing masonry. She stumbled out of bed and rushed to her front window, her heart racing as she tried to process the scene unfolding in the pre-dawn darkness. A massive Apache construction truck, its yellow bulk illuminated by powerful work lights, had crashed through the front wall of the Patterson house across the street. The vehicle's enormous steel blade had torn through the living room, where Mrs. Patterson often sat watching television in the evenings. Debris scattered across the front lawn like broken memories, pieces of furniture and personal belongings mixed with chunks of adobe and fragments of the decorative porch that James had built for his mother just 2 years earlier. Maria threw on a robe and ran outside, joining neighbors who were emerging from their homes in various states of shock and undress. Mrs. Chin stood in her driveway, clutching her telephone, speaking rapidly to what Maria assumed was a 911 operator. Tom Bradley was already at the Patterson property, calling out for Mrs. Patterson and trying to determine if anyone had been injured in the collision. The truck driver sat motionless in his cab, apparently stunned by what had occurred. Through the windshield, Maria could see a young man in his 20s, his face pale with shock, and his hands gripping the steering wheel as though he was afraid to let go. Steam rose from the damaged radiator, and hydraulic fluid leaked from the construction equipment onto Mrs. Patterson's prized rose garden. James Patterson arrived at his mother's house within minutes of the crash, having been awakened by phone calls from neighbors. His work clothes suggested that he had been preparing to leave for an early shift at his auto repair shop when the emergency calls began flooding in. His expression moved rapidly from confusion to anger as he surveyed the damage to his family's home. "Where is my mother?" he demanded, rushing toward the collapsed front wall. Mom, can you hear me?" Tom Bradley put a restraining hand on James's arm. "The paramedics are on their way. We need to be careful about going into the house until we know it's structurally safe. The back bedroom wasn't affected by the impact, so if she was sleeping there, she should be okay." Fire trucks and ambulances began arriving as the sun started to rise, their flashing lights adding a surreal quality to the chaos. Paramedics entered the damaged house through the back door, while firefighters assessed the structural integrity of the building. The Apache truck remained embedded in the living room wall, like a mechanical monster that had devoured the heart of the Patterson home. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the back of the house, supported by 2 paramedics, her silver hair disheveled but her dignity intact despite the circumstances. At 84 years old, she moved slowly but appeared to be physically unharmed. Her nightgown was covered with plaster dust, and she clutched a small framed photograph of her late husband that she had managed to retrieve from her bedroom. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice shook with the aftershock of trauma. "I was in the back bedroom when it happened. The noise was terrible, like the whole world was falling apart. I thought maybe we were having an earthquake until I saw that truck in my living room." The police arrived shortly after the emergency medical teams, led by Sergeant Rodriguez, a longtime resident of the area who knew most of the neighbors personally. His expression grew increasingly grim as he surveyed the scene and began interviewing witnesses about what had transpired. The truck driver had finally emerged from his cab and was sitting on the curb looking confused and frightened. "I don't understand what happened," the young man kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "I was just following the GPS instructions to the construction site. The screen showed me turning onto this street, but then everything went wrong. The brakes didn't respond the way they should have, and the truck just kept going forward." Maria found herself wondering whether this was truly an accident or something more sinister. The timing seemed suspicious, coming just days after the city council had approved a moratorium on demolition activities in their neighborhood. Morrison Development Company had made no secret of their frustration with the delay, and their representatives had been pressuring city officials to reverse the decision. Dr. Martinez arrived at the scene in her personal vehicle. Having heard about the crash through the emergency services radio scanner she kept in her home office. As the neighborhood's primary physician, she felt responsible for checking on Mrs. Patterson and ensuring that the elderly woman received appropriate medical attention despite her protest that she was uninjured. "Sometimes trauma symptoms don't appear immediately," she explained while checking Mrs. Patterson's blood pressure and pulse rate. The psychological impact of something like this can be more serious than physical injuries, especially for someone your age. I'd like you to come to my clinic later today for a more thorough examination. Frank Morrison appeared at the crash site within an hour of the incident, accompanied by his corporate attorney and a representative from the construction company that owned the Apache truck. His presence immediately heightened tensions among the gathered neighbors, many of whom viewed his quick arrival as evidence of prior knowledge about what was going to happen. "This is obviously a tragic accident," Morrison announced to the assembled crowd, his words carefully chosen to limit legal liability. "Our company will cooperate fully with the police investigation and ensure that Mrs. Patterson receives appropriate assistance for any damages or injuries she may have sustained." James Patterson stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and his fists clenched at his sides. "Accident. You've been trying to force us out of our homes for months, and now suddenly a truck with your company's name on the side crashes through my mother's living room? That's quite a coincidence, don't you think?" Morrison's attorney immediately intervened before his client could respond. "I need to advise everyone to avoid making accusations without evidence. Industrial accidents happen despite the best safety precautions, and we should wait for the official investigation before drawing any conclusions about causation." Sergeant Rodriguez had been quietly observing this exchange while continuing his preliminary investigation. He approached the group with his notebook out, clearly interested in documenting the various perspectives on what had occurred. His expression suggested that he shared some of the neighbors' skepticism about the accident explanation. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you a few questions about why this truck was in this neighborhood at this time of day," the sergeant said in a professional but pointed tone. "My understanding is that there's currently a moratorium on demolition activities in this area. Can you explain what construction work was supposed to be taking place here this morning?" Morrison looked uncomfortable for the first time since his arrival. "I'll need to check with our project managers about the specific scheduling details. There may have been some miscommunication about which areas were included in the council's moratorium order." The police sergeant's expression grew more skeptical. "The driver told me he was following GPS instructions to a construction site on Maple Street. Can you explain why your company would have scheduled work on this street when you knew that demolition activities had been suspended?" As the morning progressed, more details emerged that cast doubt on the accident narrative. The truck had been loaded with demolition equipment specifically designed for residential structures. The GPS coordinates programmed into the vehicle's navigation system corresponded exactly to Mrs. Patterson's address. Most damning of all, the driver's work orders, discovered in the truck's glove compartment, specifically mentioned clearing operations for 847 Maple Street, Mrs. Patterson's exact address. Rebecca Chun, the neighborhood's attorney, arrived at the scene after being contacted by Tom Bradley. Her examination of the available evidence suggested possible violations of the city council's moratorium order and raised questions about whether the crash was genuinely accidental or part of a deliberate attempt to circumvent the legal restrictions on demolition activities. This truck was clearly equipped and scheduled for demolition work at this specific address, she observed while photographing the vehicle and the damage to the house. Even if the crash itself was accidental, the presence of this equipment in violation of the moratorium represents a serious breach of the city's instructions. Media attention intensified throughout the day as local television news crews arrived to cover the story. The dramatic visual of the massive Apache truck embedded in a residential home provided compelling footage that captured public attention far beyond the immediate neighborhood. Social media posts about the incident began generating thousands of shares and comments from people outraged by what appeared to be corporate intimidation of vulnerable residents. Maria found herself once again thrust into the role of neighborhood spokesperson, this time under much more dramatic circumstances. Standing in front of the damaged Patterson house with the Apache truck visible behind her, she spoke to reporters about the broader implications of what had occurred. "This is what happens when powerful companies decide that ordinary people don't matter," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd of onlookers and journalists. "They try to force us out through legal intimidation. When that didn't work, they tried political pressure. Now we have an elderly woman whose home has been destroyed by a truck that was scheduled to demolish houses in violation of a city council moratorium." The impact of Maria's words was amplified by the visual backdrop of destruction and the obvious vulnerability of Mrs. Patterson, who sat wrapped in a blanket on her son's front porch watching strangers examine the ruins of her living room. The contrast between corporate power and individual helplessness created a compelling narrative that resonated with viewers throughout the region. By evening, the story had been picked up by state and national news outlets. Editorial writers and political commentators began using the incident as an example of corporate overreach and the need for stronger protections for homeowners facing displacement. The phrase Apache truck became shorthand for the destructive power of unchecked development interests. Morrison Development Company found itself facing a public relations nightmare that threatened to undermine their ability to operate in other markets. The visual of their truck destroying an elderly woman's home had created a permanent association between their corporate brand and the bullying of vulnerable residents. Stock prices for the publicly traded company began declining as investors worried about potential legal liability and reputational damage. 3 days after the crash, Morrison Development Company announced that they were withdrawing their plans for the Apache Springs shopping complex and will be seeking alternative locations for their retail development. The decision came after several major anchor tenants withdrew from a project due to negative publicity and community opposition. Mrs. Patterson chose to rebuild her home rather than relocate, using insurance money and donations from supporters throughout the city who had been moved by her story. James Patterson took a leave of absence from his repair shop to oversee the reconstruction process, determined to restore his mother's house to exactly the way it had been before the Apache truck shattered her front wall. Maria stood in her garden that evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains and thinking about Carlos and all the battles worth fighting. Their neighborhood had survived its encounter with corporate power, but the victory felt fragile and temporary. Other communities would face similar threats, and not all of them would have the resources or determination to resist successfully. Still, something important had been proven in those weeks of struggle. Ordinary people could stand up to overwhelming corporate power when they united around shared values and refused to surrender without a fight. The Apache truck had intended to demolish their resistance along with their homes, but instead it had become a symbol of everything they were fighting against. The neighborhood remained intact, not just as a collection of houses, but as a community of people who had discovered their own strength in the process of defending what they loved most. Maria's promise to Carlos had been kept, and their home would continue to shelter the memories and dreams that made life worth living.